Welcome to the PIXL Drone Show. This is episode 14, and today we are joined by Jon Hegranes, who is the CEO of Aloft. You may have heard of Aloft in the past. Their name was Kittyhawk. They recently changed it, and now we're going to talk to him today about a whole lot of different things in relationship to being a lens provider, to providing services for drones in general in the airspace. Jon is the founder and the CEO of Aloft. He is a leading provider of the unmanned software and airspace systems, and also our favorite lens provider, at least at Pilot Institute. They're the one that we recommend all the time. Jon is a Part 107 certified commercial drone pilot. He's also a founding member of the FAA UAS Safety Team. We'll talk about a little bit about that. He's a self-taught iOS developer. He writes about drone topics on a lot of different forums. You may have seen him on TechCrunch, on Forbes, and then we can hear him speak regularly at different industry events. So, Jon, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg, Karen, and Haye. Cool to be here, and congrats on the new show.
Thank you. So before we talk about Aloft, I wanted to bring up this FAA UAS Safety Team. Tell us a little bit more about what that is and kind of, what does the FAA UAS Safety Team does? And then you were one of the founding member.
Yeah, it started, I want to say 5-ish years ago, and as is in the name, really thinking, okay, how do we emphasize safety really across government and industry stakeholders? And it's kind of gone through some ebbs and flows. And I think we have some new leadership with Pete Dumont, who's now leading it. I recently joined the steering committee focused on the data working group. And I think where we're trying to move it forward is really to a place where it's a lot more actionable. And I think in the past, for example, just focusing on the data working group, I think the approach was very traditional aviation, like, oh, let's look at some flight data and telemetry and do some analysis. And one, that data is somewhat hard to come by, but also two, okay, if we find some learnings from that, is anything really going to happen? DJI probably has all that data already. Who are we really trying to inform? So a lot of the approach that I'm trying to take is what's more actionable kinds of data that's less, hey, let's assess the lifespan of propellers, and more so, where are we lacking in education, in awareness, something that we can really address to different segments where we have recreational pilots. What do they need to understand better? Where can we help out there? Just kind of simple kinds of data points, like we see this in Before You Fly and on Aloft, where the weekends are the busiest times to fly. So let's not focus our efforts around Tuesday kind of communications, for example. So I think there's a lot of ways to go about it, but I'm pretty excited for where it's going. You might have seen the recent DAC meeting last week where Pete presented on behalf of the UAST, and I think that's just another way that we're trying to bring a lot of these efforts together to look at, as I mentioned, recreational, but commercial, drone delivery, advanced air mobility. There's just a lot of places where I think the group can be more actionable. So I'm excited to be a part of the steering committee now and help to move it forward.
Was the UAS Safety Team involved in developing the recently launched trust program from the FAA, or no?
I don't believe so. I think that's been in the works for a while. Greg probably knows more about the inner workings of that than anyone. But I don't know for sure what role they played.
I think Kevin actually Kevin Morris was kind of the brainchild of Trust. I know he's been working on that for 2.5 years, he's told me the other day. So yeah, it's been a long time.
Wow.
I take it back a little bit. What motivated you to start Kittyhawk with Josh Ziering? Josh is a friend of mine, so I'm just curious to know that backstory a little bit.
Yeah, we were really, before we became business partners, we were friends, and typical kind of Bay Area, we kind of had a group of friends. We'd have hack nights. We'd get together and work on stuff. And he's similar to me, self-taught developer. I work on iOS and mobile side. He was working on kind of web and back-end kinds of things. And he comes from the modeling perspective. He has done that for years, since he was a kid. And so he was front and center to this drone revolution that was transpiring. And so he was really thinking, drones are real aircraft. What are the systems and tools that people are going to need as we've seen new entrants to really dealing with the airspace. We see every day. It's not a natural kind of thing, but we really saw it affecting individuals, affecting companies, really transforming business. And we thought, what are the tools and platforms that are going to be needed? So really, it just started where he showed me kind of an early version of Kittyhawk, and I was like, oh, let me start building a mobile app for this. And just slowly but surely, kind of every iteration, new feature we released, we got more usage, we got awesome feedback. We started to develop a really rampant community around what we were doing. And we're also seeing pretty crazy signups. I think some early ones that we saw were like Disney and Caterpillar, and we're like, well, these companies are like downloading our app from the App Store. They're not on our website. So it's like people at these companies are like on the App Store looking for this stuff. So after about a year of kind of hack nights and stuff, we were like, let's go full time on this, and the rest is kind of written.
Oh, nice. So I love Kittyhawk. I use it for all my LAANC authorizations, and I thought it was, the perfect brand name. And so I know this is an annoying question, but why why did you change it to Aloft? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't an easy decision, but I think, like I mentioned, and thank you for being a loyal user of our products, but we had this awesome, really brand awareness, brand affinity of what we were about, and especially I think how we focused on awesome user experiences, providing free applications for people to use, and also respecting people's privacy. And I think we've really taken a lot of steps in our privacy policies and what we do, where it's like, if you're using our products, we're not going to be selling your data. Like, you own your data. And I think that's different from a lot of other providers and kind of their approach. And so, with that, we were also thinking, where is our company going next? And I think that's where we started to think about not just our product evolution, but also our brand evolution as well. And I think as far as we've come, there's still plenty of people who are like, oh yeah, Kittyhawk, the flight logging app. And I think we really wanted to take a moment to really emphasize where we have come as a company and as a platform, where we've certainly come a very long way from some very early app iterations that I built. Unfortunately, that code is no longer there, of simple kind of, where did you fly, how long, save, to now powering over half of all LAANC authorizations, for example. So it was really a difficult decision, but really a forward-looking way to think, how can we separate from the past and really focus on how we can help the industry going forward, which really went back to our mission. Yes, we started with flight logging, but really what we're about is, how do we integrate aviators and aircraft into the airspace safely, compliantly, at scale. And we really wanted a name that kind of focused on that focus that we have and want to really emphasize. So I still have my Kittyhawk shirt and stuff like that, so it's a good throwback. But
it'll be a collector's item.
Hopefully so. So thank you for the loyal usage over the years.
Yeah, of course.
Was there any potential confusion with Kittyhawk Arrow, the air taxi service? Is that part of the decision making as well? Do you have two companies operating more or less in the same space with similar
Yeah,
names? I mean,
there was certainly a lot of confusion with other hawks in general. There's
Mhm.
a lot of hawks out there. I think there's even ones that are not super well known, but on the data side. So there was a lot of confusion. So that was part of just the thinking, but it wasn't necessarily the driving factor. But definitely a bonus to be like, oh, okay, when some other hawk is in the news, my mom or her friends don't get it confused with what's going on. Like, oh, look at what's going on.
What's been the most challenging, you think, about changing the name? We were talking about this in the office from a marketing standpoint. I'm sure your marketing people at first had some choice word when you told them you were going to change the name.
I don't know. I think they were super excited about it. It's not every not very often get a chance to go through that kind of exercise. So I think from a marketing perspective, people were super excited to be like, this is awesome. We get to tell a big story. We get to really do things at a different level than just kind of rolling along with the status quo. So I think that was exciting. Probably the challenge that we were thinking about was how do we really get the awareness out there, and particularly in this kind of COVID environment. Like initially we were kind of thinking maybe we do this around this time last year at some big conference, some big event, and then it's like, all right, we're not having any of those anymore. So we're like, all right, let's table this, think about it next year. So I think some of those intricacies were difficult. And then, some of the nitty gritty of just changing domains and all of your passwords and things that are set up. So there's plenty of that was probably less fun, but from a storytelling and, hey, let's get our name out there in a much bigger way, I think the whole team was super excited about that.
Well, thanks for the extra work, because we had to go back and change all of the names in our system because we have a ton of tutorials in our courses on how to use Kittyhawk. So we spend a couple hours. So thanks.
I'm sorry, that wasn't on our radar of like, oh, what's Greg's punch list? But, yeah.
Make sure you call next time.
Exactly.
Give you a heads up next time. Hey, Jon, I wanted to talk about the LAANC outage last week. I think it was 3 days. There was no LAANC access, causing all kinds of problems, I guess, for people flying drones. For you as a service provider, I guess it must have been quite terrifying. Can you tell us more about what exactly happened, and more importantly, I guess, how we can make sure that stuff like this doesn't happen in the future?
Yeah, it was rough. I guess the quick timeline is we saw this Sunday morning, and we alerted the FAA about this, and then I think a short while later they kind of sent an email back to all the providers, kind of confirming that there was this outage. So, part of seeing so much LAANC activity and powering most of LAANC, we kind of saw the early warning signs. So I don't think they had seen this or were monitoring that closely, on a Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned earlier, that's when a lot of people are going out to fly, especially recreationally. So
yeah,
once it went down, we were really just in support mode first and foremost of how do we let people know what is going on. And I think part of one of the main learnings that we saw was, as this wasn't an expected outage from the LAANC system, there weren't any kind of nice errors or way to show what was going on to the user. It wasn't parsable language essentially that was like, oh, here's here's what is going on. So there's a lot of proactive kind of outreach for people who I think were very frustratingly tapping submit over and over again and wondering when it was going to come back up. And we tried to, I think, just let people know and keep people updated while having a channel going on with FAA to see what was going on. And yeah, they really didn't have, and I understand this is always hard to like provide a, hey, when do you think you're going to be back up? But, you know, we kept pinging them, seeing what the updates were. And they're like, you know, our contractor's working on this, trying to figure it out. But, you know, I think pretty troubling that this unexpected error took 3 days to get sorted out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can imagine a lot of people must have been pretty frustrated about that. And I think a lot of people also are wondering, okay, so what was wrong and how do we make sure that this does not happen again in the future? But maybe that's not a question that's easily answered at this point in time.
Yeah, so, and this was talked about at the last DAC meeting. There was a question about it. But, you know, for sure it was a terrible user experience, and especially while we're in the process of really trying to increase compliance and safety. You know, I think as much as LAANC is growing, as much as we're growing as the leading provider, there's still far more flights in controlled airspace than there are LAANCs. I think that's fairly common knowledge. So having an outage like this without kind of good outreach, I think is really does a disservice to all of the momentum that we're trying to build from a safety and integration perspective. But you know, I think looking at that outage that they talked about, and I don't have any more information than what they talked about at the DAC right now, but essentially it seemed like there was some sort of maintenance thing that was supposed to happen and it was misconfigured. So we'll see what kind of details we can learn from that. But I think the main takeaway from our perspective is this is critical utility for recreational and commercial usage. And there's really no excuse for that to be down for multiple days. Like if you're running that system and this happens, you know, a couple of hours, scramble, figure it out. Multiple days, you know, I think even had, you know, different sort of conspiracy theories that we were seeing in our heavily overloaded support system where people were like, is this ransomware? And I was like, I don't know. You're going to get that much money that you might get in a pipeline. But that's the kind of questions people were thinking when a system like that is down for so long. The other thing that, you know, we were kind of talking about, and I think is evident, is that, you know, I saw a few comments about, oh, this is a good example about networked remote ID and UTM and, you know, all of the potential failings of this. And I think that's a pretty simple kind of conclusion for one to get to. We really need advanced technologies like this for what we're trying to do. For me, I think it emphasizes we need technology companies that know how to do this to be the ones providing these solutions. The FAA is excellent at, I think, airports, traditional aviation. They're trying to wrap their hands around this next wave of aviation that has tremendous scale that I don't think traditional aviation is used to. And it's much more technology forward. And, you know, if your cloud provider goes down, you don't think like, oh, I guess I should go back to having a hard drive on my desk. You're like, no, I need a better cloud provider. So I wouldn't think about this in terms of, oh, we can't use this awesome technology. It's like, no, we need to use it in the right way with trusted, verified providers where if this is going to be required and you want to emphasize safety and compliance in the airspace, let's use providers and technology and put the proper investment into making this robust system.
Cool.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. going to remote ID. What type of impact will remote ID have on Aloft or Aloft?
I don't think too much for the foreseeable future. It's still a couple of years. I think there's a lot of questions that, and I'd say we're getting a while ago. It's kind of trailed off, but just like, hey, what do I need to do? And it's like nothing. ASTM is working on its standard. This is a 2023 sort of thing. The main thing that I'd say we're focused on from a remote ID perspective that is less about the means of compliance, but more so how do we affect airspace safety? And I think that's really where Aloft is more focused, where we have to have compliance covered. Like, let's check that box. That's really fairly simple in terms of what's going to be required, whether it's firmware updates, modules, you name it. But and I've written about this quite a bit, as have others, but broadcast doesn't affect airspace safety. It doesn't enable multi-way communications. It's really, first and foremost, a very simple way that law enforcement could, in theory, act on potential drones. So cool, we've kind of gotten that step. And I think one of the really positive signs that we've seen from the FAA perspective, and we saw this with the FAA's administrator Dixon's speech just a couple weeks ago, focusing on the critical role of UTM and what that's going to mean. And we really can't have millions of drone flights compared to tens of thousands of traditional aviation flights without a network system where my drone can talk to your drone, my drone can send a different message to law enforcement. Those are the kind of systems we need. So I think from a loss perspective, we're really focused on what are the means and ways that we can affect airspace safety. And I think probably the best way that we could highlight that of just stuff we've done to date is towards the end of last year, and you did this in Before You Fly, where you could essentially crowdsource different information. And one of the main things that we saw people submitting was their intent to fly. So this wasn't some mandated thing. This was just people wanting to announce where and when they wanted to operate. That actually fits very nicely with really what our suggestion was in terms of remote ID, which was, let's think about volumes, a LAANC everywhere kind of concept. One of the DAC working groups, and this was presented last week, was thinking about notify and fly. How can you share where you're going to be flying with other operators where they can see that in advance, in real time? So those are the kinds of capabilities that we're going to be building into Aloft and Before You Fly, where come well before 2023 and actually do help fellow operators, recreational, enterprise, or beyond, understand what's around them.
When the FAA first introduced remote ID, the NPRM, a lot of people were very much opposed to having your drones being connected to a network in real time. I think your company was one of the parties opposed to that as well. Do you see any specific use case where drones should be connected to a network in real time in relationship to remote ID?
So again, I would kind of separate remote ID from a means of compliance versus what's an enabling technology to affect airspace safety and integration. In terms of the means of compliance and really where the NPRM started, I think it could have been a much simpler approach if you said networked or broadcast, not network and broadcast. I think that really kind of set things off on a wrong foot. And we had mentioned this, how, and we weren't in the cohort, so I don't know what went on there, but pretty quickly that whole conversation devolved into, all right, let's just solve a law enforcement need and kind of leave the door open to revisit this and kind of evolve it as we go. So I think one of the things that is clear is how how do we affect compliance and safety? And for a lot of people, broadcast is great, right? Cool. Let me just update my DJI firmware theoretically, and I have a compliant drone. Lovely. That's great for a lot of people. I think aside from really that chunk of, let's call it just the DJI quadcopter group, once you get kind of to either side of that, you have a lot of unhappy people that wanted more choice. On the modeling and recreational and FPV side, they wanted a networked approach because they're like, I don't want to put a module on my FPV drone that I'm flying at 20 feet. Let me do a LAANC everywhere kind of system where I could say, hey, I'm going to be flying my model here. So FPV groups, modelers, that would have been a big win. And it wasn't like you needed an internet connected FPV. You could have just, much like we do with LAANC, and that was really our main suggestion. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have companies that are like, being able to or required to broadcast information is something that I would rather put to a trusted USS provider, because I don't want my drone spouting out location information and pilot information. If that works for you and you want to do that, cool. But otherwise, let me send that privately to somewhere that I know can be trusted. So I think that lack of choice was the hardest part, both in the proposed rule and then the final rule, because aside from that kind of big group in the middle, you're losing a lot of capabilities. And I think the main thing that is missing again is, let's say I do receive a broadcast signal and there's no way to send back any sort of information. That's the next wave of technologies that we really need to think about, is multi-way communications. The other thing that, and I think it was discussed in the final rule as well, was, and we had seen this in some of our surveys that we did with our different user bases to kind of inform the comments that we wanted to make, was over and over again, people as well as companies say, I will share more information to law enforcement that I don't want going to the general public.
Yeah.
And you don't have that capability in a broadcast system that you do in a network system, where you could say, hey, I'm going to use Aloft as my USS for LAANC and remote ID, and here's information that I might be willing to share with the public. And we've seen that for years on our applications where, and I forget when exactly, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, we created the ability to share anonymous telemetry, and people do that, right? You can go in Aloft today and see where people are flying, sharing anonymous telemetry because it's useful for safety. But they don't want to share their name and other information, but they would with law enforcement. So I think those kinds of capabilities, where how do you have multi-way, multi-channel communication where different messages are going to aircraft operators, other UTM partners, law enforcement regulators, like that's the potential, is you can have a much more robust, useful system if you can send ones and zeros to another drone and say, hey, there's another drone nearby. You can send a more anonymous, useful safety message to other operators. You can send a more detailed message to law enforcement. So I think that's not in this kind of current simplified means of compliance, but that's where the industry wants to go. And I think that's where a lot of users of the airspace, both kind of thinking about advanced use cases like delivery and advanced air mobility, as well as modelers and FPV users, want to get to. So that's, I think, where we're focused on building a lot of our tech is let's show that we can impact safety by doing that.
More options and more advanced, basically.
Well, you just mentioned a keyword that for my next question, and we've been talking about UTM, UAS traffic management. For those of you that are listening that don't know what that means, Urban air mobility, advanced air mobility, those are big words that we've been hearing a lot in the last 6 months to a year. They add a level of complexity to the airspace that is already pretty complex with UTM. How do they fit into the equation with Aloft, and what challenges do you think that they're going to create from a UTM standpoint?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's still a little ways off, but we're getting closer and closer um, every day. I think from our perspective, and really our mission is how do we integrate millions of aircraft, millions of flights per day into the airspace, and um, that's really the platform that we built and are thinking about, where we've had this really useful but really kind of simple means of flight to date, where it's one person with their thumbs doing flights for fun, very valuable inspection, security kinds of flights. Um, how do we get to more autonomy, more scale, where we're able to um, do beyond line of sight, and I think it kind of scales up from there in terms of a simple beyond line of sight flight, which could be my drone's under a bridge and I can't see it, or it's on the other side of a tank or a building and I can't see it, but it's fairly close to me. All the way to I'm flying across town to drop off a package, or I'm flying a few miles away to inspect a power line. Like, that's where we start to get to. I think in terms of the air taxi and advanced air mobility side, like, that's going to be a big user of the airspace as well. And I think they're going to need much of the same kind of safety tools in terms of what's the airspace, what's the activity around me, how do I integrate with other drones as well as other traditional aircraft. So I think what we're doing and really how we're setting the stage for today with smaller drones doing advanced types of flights will carry us forward into what bigger drones carrying people will do. And I think you guys probably saw the BVLOS ARC that was just announced and getting underway. That's really starting to set the stage for how do beyond line of sight flights become much more commonplace, much the way we've seen flights at night. You used to need a waiver, now they don't. How do we get there with BVLOS and really continue on from there?
There's this great document out there from NASA, which is the UTM Concept of Operation 2.0, ConOps 2.0. And for those of you that are interested, that are listening, if you're interested in more information on UTM, I read that document a while back, and that cleared up so much in my head as to where UTM is going. And you mentioned BVLOS is the next thing. Well, that's kind of the next thing on the list. If you look at what the FAA has been, or NASA, the concept came from NASA, how they've been working on it. That's kind of step by step, and we're pretty much like step 3 or 4 right now. Now, follow up on the UTM question. In that document, in the Concept 2.0, there is a mention that manned aircraft that are operating below 400 feet, which is the UTM world, eventually will have to kind of play along with the other users of the airspace, because at the moment below 400 feet is really it's not a UAS only world. We see helicopters, we see airplanes that are operating in there in uncontrolled airspace, that is. So do you foresee a time when manned aircraft will have to request permission to enter that airspace below 400 feet, or at least share their information with other users when it becomes more complex?
Yeah, no, I like where you're going with that. And one of the things that we try and be very vocal about when we do reports to the FAA, when we write industry pieces, is really recognizing that drones are already the biggest users of the airspace today. And sure, they're tiny compared to big jumbo jets, but it's going to take a mind shift and a cultural shift to recognize that the millions of pilots and the millions of drones that we have are the biggest users of the airspace, and we're using all of the airspace. We're not just taking off from point A to point B. We're taking off all over the country, all over the world, and we're using airspace that is pretty much untapped. So how do we really recognize the fact that this is the biggest user base, and at some point, we kind of need to say, all right, as you mentioned, if you're coming into that airspace, you're defaulting to it. You're recognizing that, I'm not where I'm usually supposed to be, aside from, where a traditional aircraft might come into land. I think helicopter is another good example where they're a big focus. They're probably the ones that fly closest to where drones operate, and there's a few thousand. So, they provide great importance to society, emergency kinds of things, but there's a couple thousand of them. Are we going to build rules and systems that enable a few thousand aircraft to fly, or that enable a few million aircraft to fly? And I think that's really where we're trying to be a big proponent for all of these use cases, from recreational to air taxi, where this is the future. How do we build the infrastructure and really give the kind of attention that is demanding of the biggest user base that you have?
Aloft has partnered with AirMap in the past, and yet we know that AirMap is disliked by independent drone service providers for attempting to have airspace taxed and proposing takeoff and landing fees for drone operators. I've covered this several times in some of my articles. Do you have any thoughts on this that you can share publicly?
We were an early user of AirMap from a developer standpoint, and they had some. The main people we worked with are no longer there, but awesome team, loved what they were doing, and I was like, oh, let's do more together. And then it kind of got to a certain point where as our platform and user base was growing, we just had a much better insight. And I think really our priorities started to diverge into what's the end goal here. As you said, some of the public things that they've said, tweets that have been deleted, certainly don't align with anything that we're about. But it was really more so from a technology standpoint that we said, this is critical to our users in terms of how do you understand and access the airspace. And we said, we have really unique understanding of that from the recreational side, from the commercial side. We see potential to innovate and really do more than what we're able to do by just using their SDK at the time. So that's when, and I think going back to 2018 when we said let's do this ourselves, and that's when we built and patented our dynamic airspace platform, became a LAANC provider, started working with the FAA for Before You Fly. So I think that's really when we said let's unplug from what they're doing, and instead of feeding data to them that we didn't see good value in, saying this is something that we need to own. And kind of going back to what I said in the beginning, how do we do this from a security and privacy standpoint first and foremost, where yes, flying in the public airspace is a public act, but doesn't mean that your data should be shared. It doesn't mean that your flight should be taxed. We wanted to lead on innovation and think more value is going to come from more flights happening than from, putting things that constrict the size and activity of the airspace. So I really, since then, and, since a lot of their team changes, we don't have a lot of contact or insight into what they're doing. And, that's fine. We're on a mission.
So, Jon, currently Aloft provides a basic LAN service for free. How important is it for you that remains free for non-enterprise customers in the basic version? Is that a critical part of your marketing strategy?
Yeah, and I think really just part of our focus on safety and compliance, and kind of going back to how do network solutions provide more safety?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get more people using these tools. And I think the free versions of this and even things that we've done to bring more advanced features to the free side are pretty important as well. So that's part of our culture and something that we really want to support. Where the biggest, I think, focus for us is how do we get more people using the system, and we're still a long way away from having every flight in controlled airspace be a LAANC approved flight. So how do we move towards that?
So I want to bring up a topic that you and I have discussed in the past, which is local flight restrictions or land access restrictions in a way, because this is something that's extremely difficult to find as a user. I know a lot of people that are listening probably feel that. You go somewhere, you pop up Aloft and you look and, oh, I'm clear to fly, right? Well, not necessarily, because there may be a land restriction somewhere. I want to rope this into kind of a double question. We've seen kind of an assault on the low altitude the first 200 feet of airspace from the lawmakers recently with the Mike Lee regulation that they were trying to put in place. How does this affect what you guys do if we have regulation and local entities that can control the first 200 feet of airspace? And also, how do we get all of these restrictions to the end user? I know this is something that you guys have been working on, but it's a major struggle, I'm sure, to find all that data.
Yeah, it's kind of two things coming at this at once, where it's, as you point out, it's really not ideal if we have a lot of local regulations that become very hard to comply with and make things more complex. But I think, in an absence where there's some clear movement and things at the federal level, that's going to happen. So I think, ideally, and in a perfect world, there's one set of rules to comply with that enable flight to happen and are easy to understand. But in the meantime, we recognize there's local rules all over the place, and even ignoring more kind of things on the legislative side that are about taxes or registration. You still have just, how do you fly compliantly? And you need to understand the airspace that your drone is going to be in, but you also need to understand where you're operating from. And local parks, all over the place, different cities have these local rules that are really hard to find. And I know from firsthand experience, it's happened to me in a park in San Francisco. The park ranger shows up, says, "Hey, you can't fly a drone here." And I'm like, pretty sure my drone can be here, but it's like, oh, there's local rules for where my feet are. And really the way that we've tried to help with this is, as I mentioned, we did a crowdsourcing campaign in Before You Fly, where you can submit data and you can start to collect this, because park rangers and people that we talk to, they understand that there's no visibility into this at all. And even the San Francisco park ranger that I was talking to, he was like, "Don't worry, this rule exists. No one knows where to find it." You can imagine how well placed that is on a government website, right? So that's been first and foremost saying, "Hey, let's get more of this data in and actually give these cities a place to upload their data so that it can become useful and help people understand where to operate." And that's been super successful. We're adding in more and more data sources from parks, forestry, all sorts of things. So you can go submit that, and we're going to be building onto that so that from an awareness standpoint, you're able to operate more compliantly. But the other stuff that we've been doing is really trying to help these different states understand, what are your objectives. And I think Minnesota and I think North Carolina have like specific registration requirements that you need to do. I know Travelers Insurance, they're a customer and an investor, but they need to deal with 50 different states and a bunch of different cities for where they're operating. They're like, oh, do we need to pay tax in Minnesota because we flew drones there this many days out of the year? And I think what these states have started to figure out is the money that they put into building and kind of enforcing that is not going to result in anything close to any money that they collect from that. So what are you really trying to do? If you're trying to find a new source of revenue, probably not a great idea. So are you trying to, and I think this is where more kind of forward-leaning states are trying to go, is how do we embrace this technology? And we see this with different states with autonomous cars, right? What are the cities and states that want to attract this technology, attract this investment, attract these companies to operate? And I think, in this semi post-COVID world, cities and states are recognizing we can compete for where people want to live, and a lot of people want to live where you're advancing technology that's resulting in less traffic, cleaner skies, more efficient kinds of services. So, I think between how we can kind of help inform some of the states of what they're trying to do, and then also how do we help just operators in the meantime so that they don't get tapped on the shoulder by park rangers or local enforcement, is really our two-pronged approach to help now and in the future.
Yeah, that's a tough task. That's a really tough task. Well, Jon, we really appreciate your time. I know we're closing in on the hour here and using your valuable time. I have one last question that we always ask our guest, which is, what's your favorite drone to fly?
My favorite drone to fly? I would say, I don't know. I would say it's changing, and I would say, the other unfortunate part, as I recently moved to the DC area, is I don't don't get to fly too much anymore. Living in a bright red area, but I think and this is kind of where the product side of me always kind of goes, is, all right, what's fun to fly, but what has kind of interesting UI perspectives, interesting control elements. I'd say the two that kind of come to mind are I remember the Mavic Air being one of my favorites, just because like you put that in sport mode and it was like zooming all over the place, super fun. And then the other one that I thought was really interesting was the Parrot Anafi, in that I really like some of the controls that you could do in terms of settings, to where you could really dial in what different stick movements made and get really precise into different kinds of flights that you were trying to do. So those two come to mind. Super compact, portable, fold them up and take them anywhere.
Well, Jon, thanks for your time. We will be posting this tomorrow morning, and this is Monday today for us, and we'll be releasing this on Tuesday. For those of you that are listening, please like, subscribe, leave a comment for Jon if you have any questions on what they're doing at Aloft. Make sure that you find their app. It's on the App Store for Apple and for Android as well. And I think that's it. That's all we have. Jon, thanks again.
Thanks, guys. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. And please reach out anytime if I can be of help or service to you guys. And big fan of what you all do. So thanks for having me.